Welcome to Life Stories, where extraordinary lives and untold truths come to light. Today, we delve into the riveting tale of Victoria, a rancher's wife with a haunting past as the legendary ghost. When a ruthless criminal empire pushes too far, they unknowingly awaken a force that justice itself seemed to fear. Through resilience, cunning, and an unyielding drive for truth, Victoria's journey unfolds, blending courage with profound lessons about love, loss, and the power of redemption. Subscribe now to embark on this unforgettable journey with us. Let's begin today's story, a tale that will stay with you long after the last word is spoken. The vastness of Wyoming's high plains stretched endlessly before me. As far as the eye could see, every sunrise painted the land golden, and every whisper of the wind carried the stories of its rugged beauty. Life on the Porter Ranch wasn't just about tending cattle or mending fences, it was about protecting a legacy that my husband Sam and his family had built for generations. The ranch was more than land, it was history, resilience, and a symbol of the quiet strength that had seen us through life's many storms. It was on one of those tranquil mornings, the kind where the world seemed perfectly still, that I first noticed them. A glint of sunlight bouncing off chrome caught my eye as I surveyed the property during my routine perimeter check. 3 motorcycles idled just beyond the property line, their riders casually observing the ranch like predators sizing up their prey. They wore the unmistakable insignia of the Iron Vultures motorcycle club, a name that had become synonymous with violence and fear across Wyoming and beyond. At first glance, they didn't appear threatening, just another group of bikers passing through. But this was the third time that week I had seen them lurking near the edges of our land. They were different riders each time, but the patch was the same. The Iron Vultures had a reputation that preceded them, and their interest in the Porter Ranch sent an unmistakable chill down my spine. When I returned to the house, I found Sam at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He glanced up from the newspaper and met my gaze. He didn't need to say anything, we had been married long enough to read each other's thoughts. "They're back, aren't they?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with unease. "Yes," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee and sitting across from him. 3 this time. New riders. Same patch. They're testing us. Sam. Watching how we react. Learning our routines. Sam sighed deeply, setting the paper aside. They've been pushing everyone in the area. Land grabs. Intimidation, people are scared. Maybe it's time we consider their offer. $2 million is more than fair. It's not about the money, I said, my voice firm but calm. They've taken over every piece of land along the old ridge road. This ranch is the last piece they need to control the entire route. And that makes me wonder what they're really after. He studied me for a moment, his blue eyes searching mine. Sam knew me better than anyone. He knew my past, my training, and my instincts. He knew that when I spoke with certainty, there was no swaying me. We could just sell and walk away, he offered. Though we both knew he wasn't serious. I reached across the table and took his hand. "This land is our home, Sam. It's our family's legacy. I won't let them take it, not without understanding what they're truly after." Our conversation was interrupted by the low rumble of motorcycles. This time, the riders weren't idling at the edges of the property. They were coming up the driveway. I stood and moved to the window, watching as 3 bikes approached in a V formation. Gravel crunched beneath their wheels as they came to a stop near the front porch. Sam joined me at the window, his jaw tightening. "Do you know them?" he asked. "The one in the middle," I said, my tone neutral. "That's Vincent Romano. He's the Iron Vultures leader. Former military. Rumored to have connections with weapons trafficking. He's not here for a friendly chat. Stay inside," I told him, my voice carrying the same authority I had once used in the field. "Whatever happens, stay inside." I stepped onto the porch as Romano dismounted his custom chopper. He removed his sunglasses with a practiced air of theatricality. His movements calculated to intimidate. His companions harder. Younger men flanked him like sentinels, their eyes scanning the property for threats. "Mrs. Porter," Romano called out, his voice carrying a smooth, oily charm. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "This is private property," I replied evenly, my tone polite but firm. "You're trespassing." Romano spread his arms in a gesture that might have seemed disarming to someone less practiced in reading people. "We're just here to talk. My organization has plans for this area, big plans that could benefit everyone, including you and your husband. We're not interested in selling," I said simply, crossing my arms. "Sometimes, Mrs. Porter," he said, his tone hardening. "Progress comes whether we want it or not. Smart folks adapt. Others, well, they tend to get left behind." Romano's thinly veiled threat hung in the air, but I allowed a trace of nervousness to creep into my posture. Let them think I was just a simple rancher's wife. Let them underestimate me. "I'll discuss it with Sam," I said, feigning reluctance. "We'll let you know." Romano smiled, his confidence returning. "Take your time. But not too much. This offer won't last forever." As the motorcycles roared away, I felt Sam's presence behind me. "They're not going to take no for an answer, are they?" "No," I said quietly, watching the dust settle. "But that's exactly what I'm counting on." The days following Romano's visit were tense. The Iron Vultures didn't waste time making their presence felt. Every night, I saw their motorcycles patrolling the outskirts of the ranch, headlights slicing through the darkness like predatory eyes. Sam tried to go about his usual routine, repairing fences and tending to the cattle. But I could see the weight of their looming threat in the lines of his face and the tightness of his jaw. I kept busy, too, but my mind was constantly working, analyzing their movements, deciphering their strategy. This wasn't just about the ranch, it never had been. The strategic position of our land along Ridge Road meant something much bigger. Something they were willing to intimidate, threaten, or even kill for. I needed answers. And to get them, I had to draw them closer. That's when the rumors started reaching us. Neighboring ranchers whispered about the Iron Vultures muscling their way into small towns and back roads, forcing landowners to sell at gunpoint. Those who resisted found their homes vandalized, their livestock poisoned. But the most chilling stories were about those who vanished altogether, men and women who had once owned properties now marked by the Vultures' insignia. I spent my mornings riding out along the perimeter of our property, appearing to conduct routine checks. What I was really doing was cataloging everything: the riders' patterns, the number of men, the direction of their approach. They were careful, but not careful enough. Amateurs always left clues. And these men, despite their swagger and bravado, were no exception. It was during one of those rides that I spotted a lone biker parked near the creek that cut through the southern edge of the ranch. He wasn't wearing the Vulture's patch, but everything about him screamed scout: his casual posture, the way his helmet stayed on, his bike idling quietly as he scanned the area. I didn't approach. Instead, I watched from the cover of the trees, letting him think he was unnoticed. When he left, I followed his trail, carefully noting the direction he took. That evening, I shared my findings with Sam. He listened, his expression grim, his hands clenched tightly around his coffee mug. "We should go to the sheriff," he said. "Dawson may be stretched thin, but he needs to know what's happening here." I shook my head. "Dawson's a good man, but the Vultures have bought people in his department. I can't risk tipping our hand. If they realize we're onto them, they'll escalate." Sam didn't argue. He trusted me, even if he didn't fully understand the extent of my training or what I was capable of. I had kept those parts of my life tucked away for years. But now, as the threat loomed closer, the ghost of who I used to be began to surface. This wasn't the first time I'd faced men like the Vultures, and it wouldn't be the last. That night, I set my plan into motion. In the quiet hours, I positioned cameras in strategic locations around the ranch, their lenses hidden among the dense foliage. These weren't ordinary security cameras, they were military-grade, the kind that operated in total darkness and picked up heat signatures. They would give me the advantage of knowing when the vultures moved and how many they brought with them. The next day, Sam and I played our parts perfectly. He drove into town to pick up supplies, keeping our routine predictable. I stayed behind, maintaining the facade of a woman trying to hold her home together while under pressure. It was all about letting them think they had the upper hand, that we were unprepared and vulnerable. By the time Sam returned, my suspicions were confirmed. One of the cameras near the northern boundary of the ranch had captured movement, 4 riders crossing onto our land and heading straight for the barn. It was a test, a calculated move to gauge our response. I met Sam at the porch, holding a rifle casually but purposefully. "They're here," I said simply. His face hardened. But there was no fear. Only resolve. "What do you need me to do?" "Stay in the house," I replied. "Let them think we're panicking. They're not here for a fight yet. This is about intimidation." As Sam moved inside, I took my position near the barn, hidden among the shadows. The riders approached, their headlights cutting through the twilight. They dismounted slowly, talking and laughing, their voices carrying an air of confidence. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know who I was or what I was capable of. As I watched them, a sense of calm settled over me. These men thought they were the predators. But they were wrong. They had wandered into the wrong den. The 4 bikers strolled around the barn, their boots crunching on gravel as they examined the property like predators circling prey. Their laughter grated on my nerves. But I kept my breathing steady. They saw themselves as hunters. But they were walking straight into a trap. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a black bandana tied around his head, leaned against the barn door. His swaggering confidence was almost laughable. "Nice place," he said loudly, his voice echoing in the still evening air. "Too bad the owners don't know when to let go." One of the others chuckled. "Yeah. Shame if something happened to it." I could feel their smug satisfaction radiating as they postured for one another. But I knew better than to engage prematurely. Let them talk. Let them show me who they were and how they worked. My training had taught me that the most valuable information came when people thought no one was listening. The leader turned toward one of his men, a wiry fellow who looked younger than the rest. "Go check the house," he ordered. "See if anyone's home. Don't get caught." That was my cue. As the wiry biker began to move, I stepped out from the shadows. "Looking for someone?" My voice was calm, even pleasant. But it stopped them all in their tracks. The leader straightened, his hand moving toward his belt where a pistol sat holstered. Well, what do we have here?" he drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Kingsley. Right. Heard a lot about you." I took a step forward, keeping my rifle at my side but not raised. "And you are?" "Friends of Romano," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "We're here to make sure you and your husband understand the kind of trouble you're stirring up." "Trouble?" I tilted my head, letting a hint of curiosity show. I thought this was about a business offer. Romano didn't mention anything about threats. His grin faltered just slightly, and I pressed on. "But I suppose it's easier to negotiate when you scare people first. That's the way your kind operates, isn't it?" The wiry biker, clearly emboldened by the leader's presence, sneered. "Lady, you got no idea who you're messing with." "Don't I?" I replied, my voice soft but laced with steel. "I know exactly who you are. I've seen men like you before, loud, overconfident, and always underestimating the people they're trying to intimidate." The leader's grin disappeared entirely. He stepped closer, his hand now resting on the grip of his pistol. "Careful, Mrs. Kingsley. You might regret talking to us like that." I raised the rifle slightly, not aimed, but enough to make my point. And you might regret thinking I'm just another rancher's wife. For a long moment. The air was thick with tension. The leader's hand tightened on his pistol, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. Behind him, the others shifted uneasily. They were used to scaring people into submission, not being confronted with calm defiance. Finally, he let out a low laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts only get you so far. Farther than you think, I said, my tone steady. Now, unless you want this to escalate, I suggest you leave. Tonight. The leader studied me for another moment, then gestured to his men. Let's go, he said sharply. We've made our point. They mounted their bikes and roared off into the night, their headlights disappearing down the long gravel driveway. I stayed where I was until the sound of their engines faded completely. Only then did I lower the rifle and let out a slow breath. This had been a test, a calculated move to see how far they could push us. But now they knew I wasn't afraid, and that knowledge would force them to reconsider their next move. Sam emerged from the house, his face pale but resolute. What happens now? I turned to him, my mind already calculating. Now. They'll come back. But next time, they'll bring more men and fewer words. Should we call for help? Not yet, I said. First, we let them think they have the upper hand. Then we take it away. That night, as I reviewed the footage from the cameras, my suspicions were confirmed. The vultures weren't just interested in our land, they were protecting something much bigger. And whatever it was worth risking everything to keep hidden. The hunt was just beginning. The morning after the confrontation with the bikers, the ranch seemed unnaturally quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before a storm. I spent the early hours going through the security footage again, scrutinizing every detail of their visit. Their movements, their posturing, the nervous glances of the younger biker, all of it told a story. They weren't just low-level thugs sent to scare us. No, this was calculated, deliberate. They had a purpose here, one that went beyond intimidation. And while I didn't yet know the full extent of their operation, I knew it was time to escalate my own plans. As the sun crept higher, Sam joined me in the barn. His face was lined with worry, his normally steady hands fidgeting with a wrench. You're sure we shouldn't call the sheriff? He asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head. Sheriff Dawson's good, but he's outmatched here. The vultures have too many connections, too many ways to bury any official investigation. If we want to stop them, we need to act carefully. Carefully, he repeated, his voice heavy with doubt. And what happens if they show up with guns next time? I set the laptop aside and turned to him. Then we show them we're not as defenseless as they think. For the next several hours, I worked methodically, checking and rechecking the ranch's defenses. Motion-triggered cameras were positioned in strategic locations. Blind spots were eliminated, and emergency supplies were secured. Sam helped where he could, though I could see the strain in his movements. This wasn't his world, it was mine. And while he trusted me, he wasn't used to the kind of calculated risk that came with a fight like this. By midday, we'd finished reinforcing the property. I stood at the edge of the pasture, scanning the horizon. The land stretched out in every direction, beautiful and deceptively serene. But I knew it was more than just scenery to the vultures. It was a crucial piece of their puzzle, one they were desperate to control. As if on cue, my phone buzzed. The number was blocked, but I answered anyway. Kingsley, I said curtly. A familiar voice greeted me, smooth and insincere. Mrs. Kingsley, I trust our friends paid you a visit last night? Romano, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. You've got a strange way of negotiating. Just making sure you understand the stakes, he replied. This land is important to us, and we're willing to pay handsomely for it. But if you keep resisting, well, accidents happen. Is that supposed to scare me? I asked. My tone even. Because I've faced worse than you and your gang of misfits. There was a pause on the other end. And when he spoke again, his voice carried an edge of irritation. You're bold. I'll give you that. But boldness won't save you. My offer stands, 2 million for the ranch. Take it. Or I'll make sure you regret turning me down. I didn't reply immediately, letting the silence stretch until he finally hung up. It was a classic intimidation tactic, one I'd seen countless times during my years as a marshal. But Romano had underestimated me, just as his men had. And that would be his downfall. When I returned to the house, Sam was waiting in the kitchen, his face set with determination. What did he say? They've upped their threats, I said, pouring a cup of coffee. But they're still trying to act like they're in control. What's the plan? He asked. I looked at him, my mind already racing with possibilities. We let them think they've won. Let them make their move. And when they do, we'll be ready. That night, I began preparing in earnest. Weapons were cleaned and loaded. Escape routes were mapped. And contingencies were put in place. Every step was deliberate. Every action a piece of the larger strategy. I wasn't just protecting the ranch, I was setting a trap. As the hours ticked by, I felt the familiar calm of a hunter preparing for the hunt. The vultures had chosen their target. But they didn't realize they'd picked the wrong one. They thought they were circling prey. But they were the ones being watched. And when the time came, they'd learn what happens when you push someone too far. By the time dawn broke, the ranch was a fortress, though it didn't look like one. From the outside, everything appeared unchanged, just another stretch of Montana land, dotted with livestock and framed by a sprawling, rustic home. But beneath the surface, it was something else entirely, a place bristling with unseen defenses, watched over by someone who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of strategy. Sam and I had worked through the night, our movements synchronized as if we'd been doing this together for years. He didn't ask questions anymore, and I didn't offer explanations unless necessary. Somewhere between the threats and the preparations, he'd stopped doubting and started trusting me to lead, to protect us both. Over breakfast, he broke the silence. You think they'll come today? I nodded, stirring my coffee absent-mindedly. They're getting impatient. They'll make their move soon. What if they don't fall for it? He asked, his voice quiet but steady. They will, I replied confidently. Men like Romano think they're invincible until they're not. They don't see traps until it's too late. Sam nodded but didn't look reassured. I couldn't blame him. This wasn't his fight. Not really. He'd married a rancher's wife, not a retired federal marshal with a knack for dismantling criminal organizations. And yet, here he was, standing by my side. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the first sign of trouble appeared. A plume of dust rose in the distance, growing steadily larger as vehicles approached the ranch. It wasn't the loud, chaotic roar of motorcycles this time, but the controlled rumble of SUVs, black, sleek, and unmistakably tactical. They're here, I said, rising from the porch steps. Sam followed my gaze, his face a mask of tension. What do we do? He asked. We let them in, I replied, my voice calm. They think they're coming to take what they want. Let's show them how wrong they are. I stepped inside briefly, retrieving the small earpiece I'd tucked away earlier. Slipping it on, I activated the system I'd set up, a network of hidden cameras and microphones scattered across the property. Every angle was covered, every blind spot eliminated. As the SUVs pulled into the driveway, I watched them through the feed, tracking their movements with practiced precision. 3 vehicles, 12 men in total. Romano was at the center, his demeanor as commanding as ever. The rest were his enforcers, dressed in tactical gear and armed to the teeth. This wasn't an intimidation squad. This was a takeover team. I stepped out onto the porch as they exited their vehicles, my posture relaxed but alert. Afternoon. Gentlemen. I called, letting just a hint of sarcasm color my tone. What brings you to our little corner of the world? Romano approached first, his polished boots crunching against the gravel. Mrs. Kingsley, he said smoothly, you've been a difficult woman to deal with. Most people would have taken my offer by now. I'm not most people, I replied, folding my arms across my chest. And this ranch isn't for sale. His smile faltered, replaced by a hard edge that suited him better. I was hoping we could resolve this amicably, he said, his voice low. But you're leaving me no choice. Behind him, his men began to fan out, their movements rehearsed but predictable. They were securing the perimeter, ensuring there was no escape. It was almost amusing, watching them work so diligently to box us in when I'd spent the last week preparing for exactly this moment. Romano stepped closer, his expression one of feigned regret. Last chance, he said. Sell the ranch, or things get messy. I tilted my head slightly, as if considering his words. You know, I was going to say the same thing to you. Before he could respond, I pressed a small button on the side of the porch railing. Instantly, the sound of motors hummed to life as hidden gates locked into place, cutting off the driveway and trapping them inside. The look on Romano's face was priceless, a mix of confusion, anger, and the dawning realization that he'd walked straight into a trap. His men reacted predictably, reaching for their weapons. But they froze as the click of rifles echoed from unseen positions. You're surrounded, I said, my voice calm but firm. Drop your weapons, and maybe we can avoid making this messier than it needs to be. Romano's confidence was slipping, but he wasn't ready to give up. You think you can scare me, he spat. You're just a rancher's wife. I stepped forward, my eyes locking onto his. I've been called worse, I said evenly. But let me make one thing clear, you came after my home. My family. That was your first mistake. Your second was thinking I wouldn't fight back. As the tension thickened, the first of his men dropped their weapons, hands raised in surrender. One by one, they followed suit, until only Romano stood defiant. It didn't matter. The game was already over, and he knew it. Romano's posture stiffened, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of leverage. He wasn't used to losing control, and it was clear he didn't like how this was unfolding. His arrogance, the foundation of his power, had always carried him through situations like these. But here, on this ranch, he was out of his depth. Think carefully, I said, my voice low and measured. You have one option left, and it's the only one that doesn't end with you in a worse position than you're already in. He sneered. But it was forced. You think this ends here? I have connections, people who will come looking for me. I stepped closer, unbothered by his bravado. And what happens when those people find out you've failed? You're not their leader, you're a tool. The moment you become a liability, they'll leave you to rot. Or worse. His jaw clenched, the weight of my words sinking in. Around us, his men remained subdued, their weapons discarded and their hands raised. Sam had emerged from the house by then, a shotgun resting casually in his grip. He didn't speak, but his presence was enough to emphasize the futility of resistance. You underestimated me, I continued, my tone unwavering. You looked at me and saw someone weak, someone you could manipulate. That's how you operate, through fear, through assumption. But you made a mistake. You came after something that matters to me, and now you're going to answer for it. Romano's gaze darted to his men, seeking support. But there was none to be found. Their loyalty, bought and paid for, evaporated the moment they realized this was a losing battle. You've got no idea who you're dealing with, he growled. But even as he said it, the words rang hollow. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, I replied. A man who built his empire by preying on the weak. But here's the thing about empires built on fear, they crumble the moment someone refuses to be afraid. For a brief moment, There was silence. The kind that comes before a storm. And then, as if on cue, the sound of distant engines reached us. More vehicles were approaching, their tires kicking up dust as they barreled down the long road to the ranch. Romano's confidence flickered back to life. "Looks like you're out of time," he said smugly. I didn't react. Instead, I reached for the small earpiece I'd been wearing all day. "This is Kingsley," I said calmly. "We've got incoming. Are we ready?" A voice crackled back. "Affirmative. Teams in position." The approaching vehicles came into view. A mix of motorcycles and black SUVs. Romano's reinforcements. They pulled to a stop at the gate, their engines rumbling as the newcomers surveyed the scene. But before they could make their move, a series of unmarked SUVs appeared behind them, cutting off their escape. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged swiftly, weapons drawn and commands issued with precision. It was over before it began. Romano's expression twisted into one of pure rage as he watched his allies be disarmed and subdued. "You called the feds," he spat. I nodded. "You were sloppy, Romano. You left a trail too obvious to ignore. It wasn't hard to connect the dots." "You think this will stop us?" he barked. "There's always someone else to take over." "Maybe," I admitted. "But they won't get far. Not when people like me are watching." The agents moved in, securing Romano and his men with practiced efficiency. One of them, a familiar face from my past life, approached me with a respectful nod. "Impressive work," he said. "We've been after these guys for months. Your setup made it easy." "It's what I do," I replied simply. As Romano was led away, he shot one last venomous look in my direction. "This isn't over." I met his gaze, unflinching. "It is for you." With that, the vehicles began to depart, carrying away the remnants of Romano's operation. Sam stood beside me as we watched them go, the tension in the air finally lifting. "Is it really over?" he asked quietly. "For now," I said, allowing myself a small, weary smile. "But there's always more work to do. Always more shadows to burn away." The sun was beginning to set, casting the ranch in warm hues of gold and orange. Despite everything, it was a beautiful evening, peaceful, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally take a breath. But deep down, I knew that peace was always fleeting for people like me. The ghost might return to its quiet life, but it would never stop watching, never stop waiting, because in a world filled with predators, someone always had to be the hunter. As the convoy of federal vehicles disappeared down the dusty road, a quiet stillness settled over the ranch. Sam leaned against the porch railing, his shotgun now resting casually against the wall. He looked at me, his eyes searching for something, though he didn't voice his thoughts. "You've got questions," I said, stepping up beside him. He nodded but didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied the horizon, where the last light of day was beginning to fade. Finally, he asked, "How long have you been carrying this?" I exhaled slowly, the weight of the past settling on my shoulders. "Too long," I admitted. 15 years since I walked away from the badge. But some things don't let go. He glanced at me. "You mean you don't let go?" I smiled faintly. He wasn't wrong. Maybe. But someone has to do it. "Sam. People like Romano, they thrive because no one stands up to them. They count on fear. On people looking the other way. I couldn't let that happen here. Not to us." He nodded, his expression softening. "I get it. But you scared me, Vicky. When they took you." I thought. His voice trailed off, and he shook his head, unable to finish the thought. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I know. And I'm sorry. But I had to do it. I had to get inside their operation. Find the connections. If I hadn't, they would have kept coming." He looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. "And what happens next?" "You know they'll try to fill the vacuum. People like Romano don't just disappear without someone else stepping up. I know, I said, my voice firm. But that's not my fight anymore. The feds have what they need to dismantle his network. And I've given them enough intel to keep digging. For now. I'm staying here. With you. His expression softened further. And he nodded. His shoulders relaxing for the first time all day. Good. Because this ranch needs you. I need you. We stood there for a while, watching as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the distant hills. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of hay and earth. It felt peaceful, almost normal, as if the chaos of the past few weeks had finally been erased. But peace, I knew, was fragile. Later, as we sat at the kitchen table, Sam handed me a cup of coffee, the familiar ritual grounding us both. The kitchen, with its worn wooden table and mismatched chairs, had always been the heart of our home. Tonight, it felt like a sanctuary. What will you do if they come back? He asked after a long silence. They won't, I said confidently. Not after tonight. The message was sent. Loud and clear. This land isn't for sale. And neither am I. And if they don't listen? I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth settle me. Then I remind them why some names are better left whispered. He chuckled softly, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. You know, you're terrifying when you talk like that. I grinned. Good. We sat there a while longer, the quiet hum of the night filling the spaces between our words. Outside, the stars began to emerge, their brilliance unspoiled by city lights. It was a reminder of why we had chosen this life. This place. The simplicity. The freedom. Do you ever think about leaving this all behind? He asked suddenly, his gaze fixed on the stars. I shook my head. Not anymore. This is where I belong. He looked at me, his expression one of quiet understanding. Good. Because I can't imagine this place without you. The weight of his words settled in my chest. A reminder of what truly mattered. Not the fight. Not the justice. But the life we had built together. The ranch. The mornings spent tending to the land. The evenings spent under the stars. This was our legacy. As the night deepened, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The ghost might always be a part of me. But here, on this ranch, I had found something more. A reason to fight. A reason to stay. And as long as there were shadows to burn away, I'd be ready. Not as a marshal. Not as a legend. But as a woman who refused to be broken. A woman who had chosen to stand her ground and protect what mattered most. The next morning, the ranch seemed to breathe easier, as if the land itself had felt the tension of the past few weeks and now welcomed the calm. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting a warm golden hue across the fields. And the world felt lighter. Sam was already outside by the time I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, ready to face the day. He was fixing the fence line along the eastern border, his hat shielding his face from the rising sun. It was a familiar sight, one that spoke of the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. For a moment, I stood there, taking it all in, the land, the man I loved, and the peace we had fought so hard to protect. Morning, I called as I approached. Morning, he replied, glancing up with a smile. You sleep at all? Some, I admitted, leaning against the fence. You, he shrugged. Enough. Plenty of work to keep me busy. I chuckled softly, the sound of his voice grounding me in a way that nothing else could. You always find a way to keep busy. Someone has to, he said, his tone teasing but affectionate. And since you've retired from saving the world, I figured it's my turn to keep things running. I rolled my eyes, though I couldn't help but smile. Retired might be a strong word. He paused, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You're really staying this time, aren't you? I nodded, the weight of the decision settling into my bones. Yes. The feds have the tools they need now. They'll clean up the mess. My fight's here. Sam. Always has been. He didn't say anything. But his eyes spoke volumes. Filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. He reached for my hand. His rough, calloused fingers wrapping around mine. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just the two of us. As the day unfolded, the ranch hummed with quiet activity. Sam worked on the fencing, while I tended to the horses. Their gentle nickers a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. It felt good to lose myself in the rhythm of the work, to reconnect with the life we had built here. But even as I focused on the tasks at hand, I couldn't ignore the lingering shadows of the past. The events of the previous night had left their mark, and I knew the ripples would continue for weeks, months, maybe even years. The devil's mayhem might have been dismantled, but there were always more predators waiting in the wings, more battles to be fought. By midday, I was in the barn, stacking bales of hay, when I heard the faint rumble of an approaching vehicle. My body tensed instinctively, the old habits of vigilance still deeply ingrained. I stepped outside, shading my eyes against the glare of the sun, and saw a familiar black SUV pulling up the driveway. Marshal Kane stepped out, his expression a mixture of purpose and something softer, respect, perhaps, or camaraderie. He adjusted his hat, nodding to me as he approached. "Marshal Kingsley," he said, his tone formal but warm. "Kane," I replied, tilting my head. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. Figured I'd check in," he said, leaning against the barn wall. "Make sure everything's as it should be." I gave him a small smile. "Everything's fine. Quiet. Even." He raised an eyebrow. "Quiet doesn't usually last long for people like us." "No," I admitted. "But I'll take it while I can." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "The fallout from last night is already making waves. Arrests. Asset seizures. Connections being exposed. You did good, Kingsley." I shrugged. "Just did what needed to be done." He turned to look at me, his expression serious. "That's what makes the difference. You know, people like you, who don't just walk away when it gets hard." I held his gaze for a moment before looking away, the weight of his words settling heavily. "I didn't do it alone." "No," he agreed. "But you were the one who made it possible." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Kane said his goodbyes, promising to keep me updated on the progress of the investigation. I watched his SUV disappear down the driveway, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. Returning to the barn, I found Sam waiting for me, his arms crossed as he leaned against the doorframe. "His right. You know," he said, his voice quiet. "You made a difference." I shook my head, a faint smile tugging at my lips. "We both did." And as the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, I allowed myself a rare moment of peace. For now, the fight was over, and the life we had built here was safe. But deep down, I knew the truth. The work was never really done. There would always be shadows to burn away, always more justice to pursue. And when the time came, I would be ready. The next few days on the ranch unfolded with a rhythm that was both comforting and strange. After so many years of living on edge, of anticipating the next move in an endless game of chess, the quiet was almost disorienting. Yet, it was a gift I wasn't about to squander. Sam and I fell into our usual routines, the tasks of the ranch grounding us in the simplicity of the life we'd chosen. Mornings were spent tending to the animals, afternoons repairing fences or maintaining the equipment. There was something meditative about the physical labor, a sense of purpose that didn't rely on strategy or deception. But as the days passed, it became clear that the ripples from the Devil's Mayhem takedown were reaching farther than I'd anticipated. By midweek, a stream of calls began coming in, some from Kane, updating me on arrests and seizures, others from old colleagues who had caught wind of the operation. Each call brought new revelations about the scope of the biker gang's influence and the web of corruption they'd been part of. I kept the details from Sam as much as I could, not wanting to disrupt the peace we'd found. But he knew me too well to miss the tension in my shoulders. The way my hands lingered on the phone long after a call had ended. "You're still in it," he said one evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the hills. I glanced at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "You might be here," he said, his voice steady. "But part of you is still out there, chasing answers." I sighed, setting down my coffee mug. "I didn't ask for this, Sam. I thought I could walk away, leave it all behind. But there are too many loose ends. Too many people counting on me to finish what I started." He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Just don't lose yourself in it again, Vicky. Whatever happens. This," he gestured to the ranch. "The life we'd built together, this is what matters." His words stayed with me long after he'd gone to bed. And as I sat alone in the darkened living room, I found myself scrolling through the latest reports Kane had sent. One file caught my eye, an encrypted message intercepted during the takedown. Its origins still unverified. The text was brief, but it sent a chill down my spine. Miller was just the beginning. More to come. I forwarded it to Kane without hesitation, adding a note, "Follow up immediately. Potential threats still active." The next morning, I awoke to a text from Kane confirming that his team was investigating. But even with the reassurance that the feds were on it, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Later that day, as I was repairing the roof of the barn, Sam came out with a package he'd retrieved from the mailbox. "This came for you," he said, holding out the envelope. I climbed down the ladder, wiping my hands on my jeans before taking it. There was no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. I opened it carefully, finding a single sheet of paper inside. The message was handwritten, concise. "Thanks to you. We've lost everything. But some debts don't stay unpaid." Sam read it over my shoulder, his jaw tightening. "Who sent this?" I folded the note, keeping my voice calm. "Someone who doesn't know when to quit." His expression darkened. "We should call Kane." "I will," I assured him. "But this isn't unexpected. A power structure like Devil's Mayhem doesn't crumble without resistance." The truth was, I'd been waiting for something like this. The Devil's Mayhem wasn't just a gang, it was an empire built on fear and control. Dismantling it had left a vacuum, and I knew from experience that power vacuums rarely remained empty for long. That evening, I called Kane, sharing the note and my concerns. He listened carefully, his tone as steady as ever. "We'll increase surveillance around the ranch," he said. "And I'll have a team review any recent activity in the area." "Thanks," I said, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "But you know as well as I do, they're not going to come for the ranch. They're going to come for me." Kane didn't argue, and that silence spoke volumes. He knew, just as I did, that the fight was far from over. But as I ended the call and looked out at the familiar expanse of the ranch, I felt a quiet determination settle over me. I had faced worse odds before, and I had no intention of backing down now. This land, this life, and the people I loved, they were worth fighting for. And if the shadows thought they could creep back into my world unnoticed, they were about to learn why ghosts were nothing to take lightly. The following week passed in a strange, heavy haze, the kind that settles in the quiet moments between storms. Life on the ranch continued as it always had, but I could feel the undercurrent of unease that neither Sam nor I dared to fully name. The note was tucked away in a drawer, yet its presence loomed over us like a shadow. Kane's team had already swept the property twice, ensuring every corner of the ranch was secure. They'd installed motion sensors along the perimeter and updated the surveillance systems to a level of sophistication I hadn't seen since my federal days. But even with all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that the threat wasn't lurking in the woods or the roads leading to the ranch, it was creeping closer to the life I'd tried so hard to build. One morning, as I was saddling up Rosie, our aging mare, Sam approached with a look that told me he had something on his mind. He leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching me tighten the saddle strap. "Vicky," he began, his voice careful. "You've been up late every night this week, staring at those reports. You haven't said much, but I can tell it's eating at you." I sighed, resting a hand on Rose's manner. "It's not just the reports, Sam. It's everything. The note. The operation. The way Devil's Mayhem ran their business, it's all connected to something bigger. Something I might have missed." He frowned. "You think there's more out there?" "I know there is," I said, meeting his gaze. "Kane's still uncovering pieces. But the deeper we dig, the more we find. This wasn't just about a biker gang. They were part of a network. One that reaches farther than we realized." Sam was quiet for a moment before stepping closer. "So what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I need to be ready." That readiness came with a price, though. My nights were consumed with reading reports and strategizing, retracing old steps in my mind. Each new piece of information felt like another thread in a web I hadn't fully untangled. And while I knew Kane's team was doing everything they could, I couldn't help but feel that the key to understanding it all lay somewhere in my past. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh stack of files, my phone buzzed with a message from Kane. The text was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. "Intercepted chatter. Raven mentioned. Details unclear." Raven. The codename was one I hadn't heard in years. Not since my days as a marshal. It was tied to an operation that had gone dark abruptly, buried under layers of classified documentation. At the time, I'd been too focused on my next case to question it. Now, it felt like a thread worth pulling. I stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Send everything you've got." Kane's reply came quickly, already en route. "Be careful, Vicky." By the time the file arrived, Sam had joined me at the table, his curiosity evident. I explained the significance of the codename as I opened the file, scanning the contents with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The intercepted chatter was vague fragments of conversations between unknown parties, but the implications were clear. Raven wasn't just a codename, it was a directive. One tied to a new player in the game. The chatter hinted at movements in the area, subtle enough to avoid detection but deliberate enough to raise alarms. "They're circling," I said aloud, more to myself than to Sam. "Testing boundaries. Looking for weaknesses." Sam's hand covered mine, grounding me. "They'll find none here," he said firmly. His confidence was a balm, but it didn't erase the sense of inevitability that hung over me. I could feel it building. The pull of an old life I thought I'd left behind. Whatever was coming, it wouldn't wait for me to decide. The only question was whether I'd be ready when it arrived. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke over the ranch, I stood at the edge of the property, watching the world wake up. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a reminder of everything I had to protect. And as I stood there, the resolve that had carried me through countless operations returned, sharper than ever. Whatever or whoever was coming, they weren't ready for me. They weren't ready for the ghost. As the sun set over the ranch, painting the Montana sky in hues of gold and amber, Victoria stood on the porch, her gaze steady on the horizon. The shadows that had haunted her for so long had finally lifted, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. The ghost had done its work, exposing truths and dismantling empires built on lies. But the fight for justice never truly ends. Somewhere out there, new shadows were forming, new challenges waiting. Victoria knew she'd be ready. The legacy she had built, the network of truth seekers and justice bringers, would endure, ensuring that light would always find its way through the darkness. If you enjoyed this journey of resilience, redemption, and justice, subscribe to Life Stories for more tales that inspire, challenge, and move you. A new story awaits, and it's one you won't want to miss.